My dear brothers and sisters, tonight I stand before you with a heart so heavy that words almost fail me. Heavy as the storms I have faced on the battlefield. Heavy as the burden of carrying the destiny of my people through trials and struggles. Heavy as the nights when silence falls over the land, but the weight of responsibility keeps me awake. And yet, tonight, this heaviness is different. It is deeper, it is sharper, it is the heaviness of grief. Last night, when the news reached me, I felt as though the ground beneath me gave way. My chest collapsed, my breath was stolen, and my spirit sank into silence. I sat still, motionless, trying to understand, trying to accept, but my soul refused to accept it. And in that quiet moment, I whispered to myself, not him, not this man, not this beacon of compassion. The passing of Judge Frank Caprio struck me with a force greater than any weapon, greater than any storm. It broke me into tears. Tears I could not hold back, tears that still flow even as I speak these words to you tonight. Yes, I, Ibrahim, a man hardened by war, a man who has looked into the eyes of empires and their machines of domination, a man who has stood unbroken through threats and oppression. Tonight I am not unbroken. Tonight I am a grieving child. And why? Because what we lost is not just a man, not just a judge. What we lost is a fatherly figure for all humanity. Judge Frank Caprio was not simply a man in robes. He was not merely a figure of authority sitting behind a bench. He was something greater, something higher. He was a mirror that reflected the soul of humanity itself. He dispensed more than legal judgments. He dispensed mercy, compassion, understanding, and dignity. He taught us all a lesson that echoes across generations, that true justice is not found in the cold ink of laws written on paper, but in the warm heart that understands human struggle, in the soul that feels the pain of others, and in the conscience that cannot ignore the suffering of the weak. When I first heard of his work, I could hardly believe it. I asked myself, can this be true? Can a man like this exist in a system so often known for harshness, for cruelty, for indifference? And yet, it was true. Day after day, in his courtroom, he showed that justice could be something different. Justice could have a smile. Justice could have a gentle hand. Justice could comfort, and justice could heal. And what pains me most, my brothers and sisters, is that men like him are rare as water in the desert, rare as stars that shine brightest in the darkest nights. In a world where the scales of justice so often tilt toward the wealthy, where influence, status, and power decide outcomes, he stood like an oasis in the desert of injustice. He was not a mirage, he was real, flesh and blood, walking among us, choosing to live differently, to judge differently, to show us all that humanity could still exist even within the walls of law. He did not care about the color of your skin. He did not care about your accent, your background, your status. He did not look at you and see black or white, privileged or marginalized. He saw human beings. He saw your story. He saw your struggle. He saw your truth. In his courtroom, there was no hierarchy of worth. Whether you were the descendant of kings or the child of immigrants, whether your ancestors had come free or in chains, to him your dignity was equal. This, my brothers and sisters, is the essence of justice. Justice that dares to treat people as human beings, not as numbers, not as stereotypes, not as faceless statistics. Justice that dares to look beyond appearances and titles, beyond wealth and poverty, and sees the beating heart of a fellow human being. Too many times in our world, justice bends toward the powerful, while the powerless are crushed beneath its weight. We know this pain all too well in Africa, where often the weak are made weaker and the strong grow stronger. But in his courtroom, it was different. Judge Caprio refused to bow to such injustice. A poor mother, struggling to feed her children, did not leave his courtroom humiliated. She did not leave stripped of her dignity. She did not leave treated as if poverty itself were a crime. No, she left with her head lifted, her humanity restored, her hope renewed, and the wealthy businessman, though he may have entered with the air of entitlement, received no special favor, no undeserved privilege. In that small courtroom, there was balance, fairness, equality, something the wider world too often fails to uphold. He did not care about your religion or your class. He did not care about the symbols you carried or the garments you wore. To him, a man in tattered clothes was just as worthy of respect as a man in an expensive suit. A woman covering her head in prayer, a man carrying a holy book, or another declaring no faith at all, each was treated with the same dignity. And I ask you tonight, do you realize how revolutionary that is? In a world that thrives on division, in societies quick to judge by the sound of your voice, by the name on your birth certificate, by the passport you carry, he looked deeper. He saw the person. To him, a black man and a white man stood as equals. These were not empty words. This was his daily practice. And that is why he was loved. Because equality written only in law books is useless. But equality lived, equality practiced, equality breathed into the daily decisions of those who hold power that transforms lives. Judge Caprio gave life to equality, not through grand speeches, but through small, consistent acts. And those acts, though small in isolation, accumulated into something monumental, a legacy of hope. Think carefully about this, my brothers and sisters. Respect is the foundation of justice. You cannot deliver justice if you do not respect those who stand before you. And you cannot respect if you cannot first see their humanity. In his courtroom, respect was not bought with money, nor inherited through lineage. It was given freely because all were human. A struggling mother, trembling as she stood before the law, left not crushed but restored, sometimes even with tears of relief, because she had been treated not as a number in a file but as a human being. And yes, even the wealthy businessman received respect, not because of his wealth, but because respect, if real, must be universal. Selective respect is not respect, it is manipulation. But universal respect is the foundation of true justice. And this, my brothers and sisters, is what made him unforgettable. He showed us that the law without compassion becomes a weapon, but the law with compassion becomes a healing balm. He showed that a judge could be a servant, not of power, but of humanity. He showed that compassion is not weakness, it is the highest form of strength. He showed that mercy is not the opposite of justice, it is the completion of justice. And in doing so, he left behind a vision more powerful than any ruling, more enduring than any legal precedent. He left behind the vision of what justice should be and what humanity can become. So when I say that men like him are rare, understand me fully. I do not mean rare in numbers alone. I mean rare in courage, rare in humility, rare in love, because it takes courage to stand against systems that demand harshness. It takes humility to look at the poor and not see yourself as superior. It takes love to give dignity to those the world disrespects. That is why he was a treasure in deserts of injustice, a light in places darkened by cruelty, a voice of humanity in halls too often filled with indifference. And that is why we mourn him so deeply tonight. Because when such treasures are lost, the world feels poorer, and yet his example remains. His courtroom may now be silent, but his spirit still speaks. It speaks to judges across lands, telling them they too can be compassionate. It speaks to leaders of nations, reminding them that true power is service. It speaks to ordinary people like you and me, urging us to treat one another with the dignity we all deserve. And this, my brothers and sisters, is why Judge Frank Caprio will never truly die, because his compassion has been planted in the hearts of millions, and seeds of compassion, once planted, cannot be uprooted. They will grow, they will spread, they will bear fruit for generations to come. Last night, when the news came, I could not sleep. My body was weary, but my spirit was restless. I closed my eyes. But every time I did, all I could see was his face. I tried to silence my thoughts, but they grew louder. I lay in the darkness, and in that silence, his voice echoed in my mind, the calm voice, the warm voice, the voice that brought comfort to so many who once trembled in his courtroom. And I realized something with piercing clarity. A man who never judged with coldness, a man who chose kindness over cruelty, a man who lifted the broken instead of breaking them further. That man had left us. His absence was real, but so too was his enduring presence. In my mind, I replayed his moments as if they were scenes in a film that refused to end. I saw him seated in that familiar chair, not with arrogance, not with the harshness of authority, but with the gentleness of a father. I saw how he would lean forward, how his eyes would soften when someone stood before him in fear of what would come next. And I remembered the countless times he let people go, not because the law demanded it, but because humanity demanded it. He understood something that too few in power understand. The law without compassion is a weapon, but the law with compassion is a healing balm. I remembered the stories of single mothers, women carrying the heavy burden of feeding their children while struggling to keep a roof over their heads. They would walk into his courtroom as though carrying the weight of the world. Their hands trembled, their voices cracked, their eyes overflowed with worry. They feared that one more fine, one more punishment would crush them completely. And yet, there he was smiling gently, not mocking them, not dismissing them, smiling with the kindness of someone who understood. He listened not with impatience, not with judgment, but with full attention. He heard the unspoken words in their silence, the exhaustion in their sighs, the desperation in their tears, and instead of punishing, he relieved their burden. With his words, he told them, "You are seen, you are heard, you are valued." My brothers and sisters, think of the impact of that moment. For those women, justice was not just a fine cancelled, it was dignity restored. It was the reassurance that society had not completely abandoned them. It was a light reminding them that their struggle was not invisible. For a mother fighting day and night just to feed her children, such compassion is more precious than gold. Judge Caprio gave that compassion freely, and in doing so, he gave them the strength to carry on one more day. I also remember the young men who stood before him, often young men from marginalized backgrounds, young men who had known nothing but the harshness of a system that judged them long before they ever spoke. They carried the weight of stereotypes. They carried scars from a world that punishes the poor simply for being poor, a world that punishes the marginalized simply for daring to survive. And yet, in Judge Caprio's courtroom, something different happened. Instead of adding more chains to their necks, he gave them hope. He did not look at them and see criminals. He looked at them and saw young men with potential, young men with a future still unwritten, young men who needed not another burden but another chance. With his words, with his gestures, with his decisions, he said to them, "I believe in you." And brothers and sisters, when the world tells you every day that you are worthless, that you are destined to fail, to hear even one person say, "I believe in you," can change the entire course of your life. He reminded them that a mistake does not define a man, that poverty is not a crime, that youth is not a permanent sentence of failure. He gave them the chance to rise again. And that chance, small as it may seem, was sometimes all they needed. How many of those young men walked out of his courtroom with their heads held a little higher, with their hearts a little lighter, with their futures a little brighter? How many chose a better path because one man in one courtroom decided not to crush them but to lift them? We may never know the numbers. We may never know how many lives he redirected from despair, how many souls he rescued from drowning in shame. But deep in my heart, I know they are countless, because when a man like Judge Caprio sits on the bench, his influence does not end at the courtroom walls. It travels outward. It follows those people into their homes, into their neighborhoods, into their children's lives. Think of the child who sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, watching a parent stand before the judge, fearing humiliation, fearing punishment. That child, wide-eyed, expected to see cruelty, but instead they saw kindness. They saw justice with a human face. That memory will never leave them. That child will grow up knowing that not all authority is cruel, not all systems are merciless, not all judges are blind. That child will carry the seed of hope planted in that moment. And one day, perhaps, that child will show compassion to someone else because they once saw it given to their family. This is the ripple effect of mercy. It spreads farther than we can measure. That is why Judge Caprio's legacy is so powerful. He was not just ruling cases, he was shaping lives, shaping generations. He was teaching us that kindness in power is not weakness, it is the highest form of strength. Brothers and sisters, imagine the alternative. Imagine if those mothers had been fined, if those young men had been condemned, if those children had witnessed cruelty instead of compassion. Imagine the bitterness that would have grown, the despair that would have spread, the anger that would have taken root. That is what happens in most courtrooms. That is why the world is filled with pain. But Judge Caprio chose differently. Again and again, he broke that cycle. He chose humanity, and by choosing humanity, he changed destinies. That is why, when I think of his passing, my eyes fill with tears, because the world has lost a rare man, a man who proved that justice does not have to be blind to human suffering, a man who proved that mercy does not weaken the law, but strengthens it, a man who showed that kindness does not undermine authority, it dignifies it. Last night, I could not sleep because I knew that with his passing, a voice of compassion had been silenced, But at the same time, I also knew that the echoes of that voice will never die. They remain forever in the hearts of those he touched. And so I wept. I wept not just for myself, but for humanity. Because when men like him depart this world, the void they leave cannot easily be filled. In a time where judges often sit distant, cold, ready to condemn without blinking, he was warm, approachable, human. In a time where justice so often bows before wealth and influence, he stood upright, fearless, rooted in fairness. In a world where cruelty is too often the choice, he chose compassion every single time. My brothers and sisters, tonight, I do not stand before you as a president, nor as a soldier, nor as a revolutionary. Tonight, I stand before you simply as a grieving man, mourning another man who inspired me deeply. When I heard of his passing, I thought not only of my own pain, but of the pain of humanity itself. For when men like him depart this world, a void is left behind, a void that cannot be filled easily, a silence that echoes louder than words. At a time when too many judges sit on high seats, cold and untouchable, ready to condemn without a moment's hesitation, he was different. He was warm, he was approachable, he was human. At a time when justice too often bows before wealth and power, he stood upright, fearless, rooted in fairness. At a time when cruelty seemed easier than compassion, he chose compassion again and again. My brothers and sisters, I want you to feel my heart tonight. I am not speaking as a leader, nor as a soldier, nor even as a revolutionary. Tonight, I am speaking simply as a grieving man, mourning another man who inspired me deeply. When I speak of justice for my people, when I speak of liberation for Africa, I know that justice without compassion is incomplete. Judge Caprio, though he lived oceans away, though he walked in another land, showed us all what compassion looks like in action. He showed us that compassion is not a theory, not a dream, it is a choice, a discipline, a practice. There is something powerful in his story that must be shared. Judge Caprio grew up as the son of immigrants. He knew the struggles of working people, the dignity of quiet labor, the pain of those who often go unseen. And because he knew those struggles, he never forgot where he came from. That is why, when people stood before him, he did not see strangers. He saw reflections of his own journey, reflections of his father, his mother, his neighbors, his childhood. That is why his judgments carried warmth. They were rooted not only in law, but in empathy. And that is what made him beloved. Let me ask you tonight, how many judges can we name who are mourned by ordinary people as though they had lost a family member? How many judges become legends not for punishing the wicked, but for uplifting the struggling? How many courtrooms are filled not with fear, but with love? Frank Caprio was one of those rare men. He did not build monuments of stone, he built monuments in human hearts. And those monuments will never crumble. When I heard of his passing, I remembered the poor mother in Providence who once told him she could not pay her fine because she had to feed her children. And he said to her, "Your priority is your children. You are a good mother." Think of the power of those words in a world that often crushes the poor. Those words were like light in the darkness. She walked out of that courtroom not only free of a fine, but free of despair, restored with dignity. That was his gift. That was his greatness. I thought of the young man ashamed, expecting harsh punishment. Judge Caprio looked at him not as a criminal, but as a young man with a future. And in giving him another chance, he told him, "I believe in you." My brothers and sisters, to believe in someone abandoned by society is one of the greatest acts of love. Judge Caprio believed in people. He believed in humanity. He reminded us all that justice without humanity is nothing but cruelty dressed in official robes. And so today, as I pay tribute, I must say this clearly. Judge Frank Caprio was not just an American judge. He was a judge for humanity. He was a symbol of what justice should look like anywhere, in America, in Africa, in Asia, across the world. He broke the chains of cold law and replaced them with bridges of mercy. He stood as a living reminder that compassion is the highest form of justice. And I know tonight that many across the world are grieving. They grieve not in one language, not in one country, not in one culture alone. They grieve in whispers and in prayers, in silence and in tears. They grieve in churches and in mosques, in crowded cities and in quiet villages. They grieve in places where his name was well known, and in places where people had only heard a single story about him. That is the power of a man who lived with humanity at his core. His passing has crossed every border, every boundary, every division. Black and white, rich and poor, immigrant and native-born people everywhere feel this loss. That is not something we can say about many men. Too often, when leaders or judges pass away, only their own circle mourns. The powerful mourn their powerful friends. The wealthy mourn their wealthy companions. Communities mourn their own. But Judge Caprio belonged to everyone. His kindness made no distinction, and so in his passing, the grief makes no distinction. Think about this, my brothers and sisters. The poor man who once stood trembling before him will shed a tear tonight. The wealthy man who saw fairness, not favoritism, will feel sorrow tonight. The immigrant mother who once feared the law but found mercy instead will remember him tonight. The child who once watched their parent receive dignity instead of humiliation will pray for him tonight. The student who once watched clips of his judgments online and felt inspired to study law with compassion will mourn him tonight. From Africa to America, from Asia to Europe, from one end of the world to the other, people who never even entered his courtroom will say, the world has lost a good man. And that, my brothers and sisters, is the proof of greatness. For greatness is not measured by wealth, nor by titles, nor by monuments of stone. Greatness is measured by the number of hearts you touch, the number of lives you uplift, the number of people who feel emptiness when you are gone. And tonight, emptiness is felt everywhere. That is greatness. For when you die and people of every race and nation mourn you, you have truly lived a life of meaning. Think of how rare this is. Many men live and die unnoticed outside their own circle. Many leaders live with fame but die remembered only by their failures. But Judge Caprio is mourned across color, across creed, across borders, across oceans. When a man in Africa, a woman in Europe, an immigrant in America, and a child in Asia all feel sorrow at your passing, then you know your life was not personal, only it was universal. Judge Caprio's life was meaningful. Every day he walked into that courtroom, he was writing a legacy. Not a legacy in dusty books, but a legacy in living hearts. A legacy of kindness, a legacy of fairness, a legacy of justice with a human face. He could have chosen another way. He could have chosen to be cold, distant, harsh. He could have chosen to see only the law and not the person. But he chose meaning over power, compassion over cruelty, humanity over indifference. And because of that choice, his life was rich not with possessions but with purpose. His death is painful. Painful because we feel robbed of more years of his wisdom, more years of his compassion, more years of his presence in a world so desperately in need of men like him. Painful because when the world is drowning in injustice, losing a voice of mercy feels unbearable. Painful because, though we are grateful for the years we were given, we always hope for more. And yet, though the pain is heavy, it is also proof of love. For we do not grieve those who meant nothing to us. We grieve deeply only when someone meant so much. His kindness lives on. It lives in the children who saw it and will grow to repeat it. It lives in the young judges, the young lawyers, the young leaders who watched him and learned from him that justice without humanity is nothing at all. His fairness lives on, echoing like a melody carried by the wind, reminding us that true authority is not about domination, but about service. An eternal legacy means that even 50 years from now, even 100 years from now, someone will still tell his story. A young law student will still sit in a quiet room, watching recordings of his judgments and whisper, "This is the kind of judge I want to become." A parent will still share a video with their child and say, "Look closely. This is what compassion looks like in action. This is what dignity looks like when it is given freely." A leader in some faraway land will still be reminded that power was never meant for pride but for service. And each time that happens, Judge Caprio lives again. Each time his story is told, each time his kindness is remembered, each time someone chooses mercy because they once heard his words, he is alive in us. So tonight, even as we mourn, we must also rise. Rise with gratitude for the example he gave us. Rise with determination to continue his work. Rise with the awareness that his passing is not the end, but the passing of a torch. The torch he carried so faithfully now rests in our hands. And if each of us, in our own small way, shows compassion where there is cruelty, mercy where there is harshness, dignity where there is humiliation, then his legacy will not simply remain eternal. It will grow eternal. It will multiply. It will spread far beyond what even he imagined. This, my brothers and sisters, is why his story will never fade. Because his story is not just his, it is ours. It belongs to everyone who believes in justice touched with humanity. It belongs to everyone who believes that a judge can be a servant of compassion rather than an instrument of fear. It belongs to everyone who believes that greatness lies not in how much power you hold, but in how much love you give. And so tonight, as people grieve in every corner of the earth, let us remember that even in our grief, there is hope. Because if one man could touch so many lives in a single lifetime, then surely we too can touch the lives around us. If one judge in one small courtroom could inspire the entire world, then surely the world itself can be changed. The question is only this: will we choose to follow his example? Judge Caprio's life was meaningful. His death is painful. But his legacy, his eternal legacy, reminds us all that humanity at its best is still possible. I ask myself tonight, what does his passing demand of us? It demands that we continue his mission. It demands that we carry his torch of compassion. It demands that in our homes, in our communities, in our nations, we remember that justice is not about punishing, but about uplifting. It demands that leaders, judges, politicians, and all who wield authority remember that their first duty is not to power, but to humanity. If Judge Caprio could do it in a small courtroom with limited tools, with nothing but a robe and a chair, then what excuse do we have, we who stand with the power of nations, with the power of institutions, with the power of systems in our hands? Brothers and sisters, forgive me if my voice trembles tonight. Forgive me if my words come with tears. But I want you to know that I am not ashamed to weep for this man, because true strength is not in hiding emotions. True strength is in honoring those who deserve our love. And Judge Frank Caprio deserves our love. He deserves our respect. He deserves our gratitude. Tonight, I send my deepest condolences to his family, to his loved ones, to those who were blessed to know him personally. And I say to them, you are not alone in this grief. The world weeps with you. Africa weeps with you. I weep with you. Because though he is gone from our side, he is not gone from our hearts. He lives in the laughter of every child spared from hardship. He lives in the relief of every mother who left his courtroom with dignity. He lives in the hope of every young man who walked away not condemned, but lifted. He lives in us, in the way we choose to live tomorrow, in the way we choose to treat one another. So tonight, I ask you to pause and reflect on the life of this great man. Pause and remember that humanity is fragile, that life is short, and that what gives life its true meaning is not wealth, not titles, not power, but love, compassion, and justice. Judge Frank Caprio showed us that. He showed us the way. He lit a path that will remain bright as long as we have the courage to walk it. Rest in peace, Judge Caprio. The world is darker without you, but the light you lit will never be extinguished. Your compassion lives on. Your justice lives on. Your legacy continues to guide us. And I, Ibrahim, bow my head tonight in your honor. May your soul rest in eternal peace. May your light shine forever in the memory of humanity.